The boarding call echoed through the lounge. Boarding for Aerolux Flight 714 to Zurich. A moment that seemed ordinary, yet beneath it, an unseen drama was waiting to unfold. True power does not need expensive suits or grand declarations. Sometimes it wears a plain hoodie, sitting quietly in the corner, as if nothing about it is remarkable. Ethan Ward, 40. 1. CEO and founder of Visionary Dynamics, chose a seat apart near the window. To anyone passing by, he was just another traveler. Faded jeans, minimalist sneakers, a grey hoodie with no logo. Some glanced at him with fleeting curiosity, perhaps an indie musician fresh off a record deal, or a lucky man bumped up to first class. None of them imagined the laptop bag at his feet carried a contract that could decide the future of an entire corporation. Yet beneath that calm exterior, Ethan's heart beat with tension. He knew how fragile the game was. Visionary Dynamics, his creation born from a dusty garage in the Bronx, stood on a razor's edge. One misstep, if the Zurich deal failed, and 800 employees, years of sweat and sacrifice, the memory of his late parents, all of it would vanish like soap bubbles in the wind. His hand tugged lightly at the zipper of his hoodie as his eyes gazed through the tall glass onto the runway, where steel birds lined up for takeoff. In that moment, he remembered his mother, a librarian who taught him that knowledge was the only power no one could steal, and his father, a patient mechanic who dismantled engines piece by piece, showing him that everything could be repaired. Ethan had woven those two philosophies together to build his technology empire. And tonight, every belief rested on this flight. In the luxury lounge, the air played its own symphony of wealth, the clink of crystal glasses, the hum of men in Armani suits discussing mergers, the rhythm of designer heels on plush carpet. A few looked Ethan's way, before turning back with half smiles. In their eyes, he didn't belong here. And that was exactly how Ethan wanted them to think. He thrived on being underestimated, for their dismissal became his perfect shield, allowing him to observe everything more clearly. On his wrist, hidden beneath his sleeve, was not a flashy Rolex or a lavish Patek, but a simple Calatrava watch. He had bought it for himself when the company first turned a profit. Every tick was not just time passing, but a reminder of how far he had come from that tiny garage. He took a sip of water, eyes narrowing slightly. Once again, he checked the email confirming his seat. 2A, first class. He had chosen it deliberately, a window seat with enough space to rest and prepare for the decisive meeting with von Stein AG. He needed to walk into that boardroom with a sharp mind and an unshakable resolve. No one here knew, no one even imagined. The man in the plain hoodie was about to decide whether Aerolux kept a $50 million contract or lost it to one foolish misstep. The truth was waiting to be revealed. Ethan knew that within hours, everything could change, for him, for his company, and for all the people milling about around him, unaware that their assumptions about where they stood in the social hierarchy were about to be shattered. He leaned back and closed his eyes, but beneath the stillness, every muscle was taut, every thought razor sharp, preparing for a silent battle. And no one in that elegant room, not even those smirking as they cast dismissive glances his way, could imagine that within hours the man they thought didn't belong would become the center of an earthquake where prejudice would be forced to pay in money, in careers, and in pride. The boarding gate opened, and a gust of cold air rushed in from the metal jet bridge. Ethan stepped forward, his laptop strapped tightly over his shoulder. Each step felt as heavy as a drumbeat, because he knew he wasn't just carrying luggage, he was carrying the lifeblood of visionary dynamics and the hopes of hundreds of people. First class was an island of luxury, pale leather seats, glossy veneer partitions, warm golden lights reflecting off crystal glasses. Ethan found his seat, 2A. He stowed his laptop in the overhead bin and let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing after hours of waiting. These next 8 hours would be the most important. Time to rest, to prepare. He had barely closed his eyes when a woman's voice cut in, firm but cloaked in a professional smile. "Sir, may I assist you with anything?" Ethan looked up. Standing before him was Clara Myers, the lead flight attendant, 38 years old, her blonde bob cut neat, her lips painted with a cold red. The name badge on her chest gleamed, but her eyes did not. They were sharp, probing, like an invisible security scanner. "No, thank you. I'm fine," Ethan replied softly, his deep voice steady, striving for calm. Clara tilted her head, lips curling faintly. "This is first class, sir." Ethan pointed to the seat number. "Yes, 2A. This is my seat." For a split second, Clara's smile stiffened. Not out of surprise, but out of reluctance, as if she had just heard something that clashed with the reality she believed. "I'll bring your welcome drink. Champagne, orange juice." "Just water, thank you." Clara nodded and walked away, her posture rigid. Ethan watched her go, recognizing something all too familiar in her eyes. It was the same look he had endured from valet staff who assumed he was there to drop off a car, from store clerks who shadowed him as if he might steal, from real estate agents who told him, "The house has already been taken." A tiny cut, a slow, aching wound, 1,000 times repeated across a lifetime. And now, even here, in the cabin he had paid for in full, it appeared again. Ethan drew a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Don't let it take space in your mind. Zurich was the goal. But he didn't know then that Clara's fleeting glance and condescending smile were just the spark. The real storm was still ahead. Around him, the other first-class passengers took their seats. A German businessman in a striped suit across the aisle, a young French couple chatting softly behind him, and finally, a man entered with an air of overwhelming self-importance. Silver hair slicked back, a navy blazer with a family crest pinned to the chest, his steps slow and deliberate, as though this cabin belonged solely to him. His eyes swept the room, then landed on Ethan. A faint frown, a flash of irritation. This was Gerald Whitman, 60, 7 years old, a long-time frequent flyer, a platinum elite who always treated the airplane as his personal drawing room. He stopped right beside Ethan's seat, not addressing him directly, but turning to Clara, who was passing out hot towels. His voice rang across the cabin. "Clara, there must be a mistake. This young man is sitting in my seat." The atmosphere froze. The French couple fell silent. The German businessman looked up. Everyone waited for Clara's response. Her smile brightened, but not for Ethan, for Gerald. "Mr. Whitman, it's wonderful to see you again. Let me check right away." She turned to Ethan, her tone firm. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll need to see your ticket. There may have been a system error." A chill crept down Ethan's spine. He had witnessed this scene countless times, but never in a place where respect should have been unquestionable. He pulled out his phone, showing the confirmation with seat 2A. Calm, steady, but inside a fire was catching, and he knew the worst had not yet come. This was only the beginning. The air in first class grew heavy, as if someone had drained the oxygen. Every eye turned toward seat 2A. Ethan sat still, his back straight, his hand resting on the phone that displayed his electronic ticket. Evidence no one could dispute. But Gerald Whitman stood there, chest puffed out, his commanding voice not asking but declaring, "He's sitting in my seat, Clara. Seat 2A. I've flown in this exact spot for 15 years, never once wrong." Clara nodded rapidly, her smile turning into a mask meant to soothe Gerald. Then she turned to Ethan, her eyes colder than before. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. We'll arrange another seat, further back." The words, "further back," dropped like a blade. Ethan felt the stares of curiosity, the quiet whispers of other passengers. A small moment, yet it carried the weight of history, where invisible lines still dictated who sat where, who was deemed worthy, and who was not. Ethan drew a deep breath. His voice was steady, low, not loud, but resonant like a drum inside the hearts of those watching. "There is no mistake here. My ticket clearly says 2A. I paid for this seat." He held the phone up for Clara to see, sliding it across so the confirmation was undeniable. Seat 2A. First class. Irrefutable. But Clara only glanced at it as if checking counterfeit papers at a street market. "Yes, but Mr. Whitman is one of our priority passengers. There must be a system error. Please cooperate so we can keep the flight on schedule." Gerald folded his arms, tilted his chin upward, a smug smile spreading across his face. To him, Ethan was nothing more than a system error, a mistake that needed to be erased so the familiar order could be restored. Ethan set his phone down on the tray table. He rose to his feet. The cabin held its breath. Clara allowed herself a faint smile, thinking he had given in. But Ethan didn't move. He stood tall, taller than Clara, his eyes locked on hers. His voice was low, but each word cut like steel. "I am not causing trouble. I am only sitting in the seat I paid for. If there is a mistake, it isn't mine." The words struck like lightning. Clara faltered, Gerald scowled, and the cabin itself seemed to tremble in silence. The German businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching intently. The French couple behind stopped whispering and leaned in. A drama had begun, with Ethan unwillingly cast as the central figure. Gerald's voice growled, his laugh dripping with disdain. "Listen, young man, I don't know how you got that ticket. But some things have their order. Men like you should know their place. Coach would suit you much better." Coach. The word spat out as an insult. Not just a lower seat class, but a way of reducing the man before him. Heat surged up Ethan's neck, but his eyes remained cold. He didn't yell. He didn't lash out. He simply let out one quiet sentence, soft enough to make Clara shiver. "Call the captain. I want an explanation from the highest authority here." Clara pressed her lips together. In her carefully painted eyes flashed a moment of irritation before she spun on her heel and strode toward the cockpit. Gerald chuckled, his smug laughter filling the silence of the cabin. Ethan sat back down, his hand clenched into a fist, though his heartbeat stayed steady. Deep down, he knew. This battle had only just begun, and it would decide far more than a seat on a flight. It would expose the true face of an entire system. The cockpit door swung open. The sound of leather shoes struck the carpeted floor of first class in steady rhythm. Martin Hale, 50-2, captain of Aerolux, stepped out. He carried the look of a man weathered by years in the skies, silver at his temples, broad shoulders, a face hardened by thousands of flight hours. For a moment, his very presence radiated authority, the kind passengers instinctively obeyed. But authority does not always walk hand in hand with justice. Clara moved quickly to him, whispering a brief account. Martin needed no more than a few words. His eyes swept the cabin and stopped on two contrasting figures. Gerald Whitman, seasoned, dressed in a sharp navy blazer, arms crossed like an aristocrat affronted, and Ethan Ward, a man in a simple grey hoodie, sitting calmly yet with eyes that refused to yield. One glance. Martin made his decision. "Gentlemen," the captain's voice rumbled, firm, leaving little space for dissent. "I am the highest authority on this flight. To ensure we depart on time, I am instructing you to move to economy class. The ticketing issue will be addressed once we arrive in Zurich." The cabin fell silent. Ethan looked up, his gaze cutting through the captain's facade of authority like a drill. He spoke slowly, deliberately, every word sharp. "This is the seat I paid for. My ticket clearly states 2A. You are asking me to give it up simply because another passenger made a claim without verifying the truth." Martin crossed his arms, his eyes cold, his voice edged with finality. "I have all the information I need. Mr. Whitman is a Platinum Elite passenger who selected this seat in advance. We cannot delay the flight over a minor issue. You are the only variable that can change. If you do not comply, I will have security escort you off." Each word struck like a hammer blow. The only variable that must change. Heat surged through Ethan's body, though outwardly he remained composed. In that moment, he understood. Reason was meaningless. They had already decided his role, the man who did not belong. Other passengers stayed silent, watching. The German businessman frowned but said nothing. The French couple bowed their heads, whispering quietly, avoiding his eyes. No one intervened. No one dared. Ethan rose to his feet, not in surrender, but to burn each face into memory. He looked at Clara, catching the flicker of triumph at the corner of her lips. He looked at Gerald, the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes, like a man reclaiming territory. And finally, he looked at Martin, the captain, wearing the uniform meant to embody discipline and justice, yet delivering the most unjust verdict of his career. Ethan picked up his laptop, pulled his suitcase down. The curtain between first class and economy swayed shut behind him, like the fall of a stage curtain, marking the end of Act 1 in a tragedy. But inside his heart, a vow was etched deep. They think I am just a variable to be removed. But they have just made the costliest mistake of their lives. And that mistake, Ethan would turn into a price Aerolux would pay, in money, in careers, and in dignity. The curtain between first class and economy closed behind Ethan with a faint sound, yet to him it echoed like the iron door of fate slamming shut. He walked down the narrow aisle, laptop in hand, suitcase rattling behind him. Dozens of eyes followed, some curious, some pitying, and a few satisfied, as if pleased to see an outsider dragged down from a throne they themselves had never been allowed to touch. A child stopped crying, staring at him with clear, innocent eyes that seemed to ask, "What did you do wrong to be punished like this?" Ethan held his chin high. No glance to the left, no words of defense. He knew this moment would be etched into the memory of those watching, and he wanted them to remember not the image of a man broken, but the cold silence of someone refusing to bow before injustice. The pop of champagne came from the front. Gerald Whitman's booming laughter followed, twisting like a blade in Ethan's back. "Order has finally been restored," he boasted to Clara and a few other passengers. The cabin returned to its usual rhythm of luxury, while Ethan was pushed into the cramped, noisy world behind. Seat 34B, a middle seat, wedged between a sleeping student and a mother holding a crying baby. Outside the window, the silver wing stretched against the roar of the engines. In front of him, only a cheap grey plastic panel, a stark contrast to the glossy veneer he had just left behind. He sat down, his back pressed against the hard seat. The air was thick with the smell of plastic, sweat, and baby formula. The contrast was suffocating. Ethan drew in a deep breath. Rage boiled in his chest like molten lava, threatening to erupt and scorch everything. But he knew that losing control would only make him the failure they already believed him to be. From years of being underestimated, he had learned that silence can sometimes be the sharpest weapon. He closed his eyes. Images flashed one after another. Gerald's triumphant face, Clara's condescending smile, Martin Hale's cold stare. Each one carved into his memory like 3 blades. And he knew each cut would be returned, not with curses, but with the only language this corporate world understood: money, power, and dignity. Ethan opened his eyes. His hand gripped the zipper of his laptop bag. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from determination. Inside that bag was more than just a computer. It held his arsenal, the contract, customer data, financial intelligence, and above all, the power to decide the fate of Aerolux Airlines. He whispered to himself, so low only he could hear, "You forced the wrong man out of his seat." The seatbelt sign lit up. The plane began to roll down the runway. But for Ethan, this was no longer just a flight from New York to Zurich. It had become a battlefield where he would repay every ounce of humiliation with a counterstrike that would leave the entire Aerolux empire trembling. The aisle stretched before Ethan like an endless corridor. Every step weighed heavy, not because of his suitcase, but because of the dozens of eyes pinned to him. Some looked with curiosity, some with pity, others with smug satisfaction. In that moment, he felt like a man stripped of his rights, paraded through a silent trial where everyone played judge, but no one needed evidence. A young passenger whispered to his companion, "Probably booked the wrong ticket." The other replied, loud enough for Ethan to hear, "Just look at the way he's dressed." Idle words, but each one stabbed like a needle. Ethan clenched his jaw, spine straight. No, he would not let them see him broken. The pop of a champagne cork from the front rang out like fireworks, celebrating Gerald Whitman's victory. His triumphant laughter drifted back, cutting through the rumble of engines preparing for takeoff. Clara leaned in to pour his drink, her face glowing with the pride of someone who believed she had done her duty. And Martin Hale, no doubt, had returned to the cockpit, convinced he had resolved the incident neatly. Ethan passed through the curtain separating first class from economy. Just a piece of fabric, yet as it closed behind him, it felt like a wall locking him into another world, cramped, noisy, stripped of all elegance. Seat 34B awaited him, a middle seat, its backrest worn, the tray table scratched. To one side, a student slumped over his backpack, breathing steadily in sleep. On the other, a young mother rocked a crying baby, exhaustion etched across her face. Ethan lowered himself into the seat, stowing his bag beneath, his back pressed against the stiff cushion. The contrast was bitter. Minutes ago, he had reclined on polished leather, crystal glass before him. Now cheap plastic and a child's cries surrounded him. Not because he couldn't afford better, but because others had refused to believe he deserved the seat he had paid for. Ethan closed his eyes. Images flickered through his mind. His parents, smiling in memory. Countless sleepless nights in a cramped garage, writing lines of code. The hopeful faces of visionary Dynamics employees who had placed their trust in him. And then three faces burned clearest. Clara's condescending smile, Gerald's smug grin, Captain Hale's cold stare. 3 scars etched deep, 3 verdicts yet to be delivered. He inhaled deeply and opened his eyes. His heartbeat steadied. From anger, he shifted to a dangerous calm. The calm of a forge, when the fire has burned hot enough for steel to soften, ready to be shaped into a blade. Ethan's hand brushed his laptop bag. Inside was more than just a tool of work. It was his weapon. With it, he could overturn the board, transform this moment of humiliation into a sentence against Aerolux itself. He whispered inwardly, like a vow, "You just wagered the future of your company for a single seat." The plane shuddered as it began to taxi down the runway. While hundreds of passengers prepared for a long flight, Ethan was preparing for battle. And this was not a battle he intended to lose. The engines roared as the plane lifted off the runway. Golden light streamed through the small window beside seat 34B, casting a glow across Ethan Ward's solemn face. Surrounded by the cries of a child, the heavy breathing of a drowsy student, and the creak of plastic seats, Ethan's mind was already shaping a cold, precise plan. He unzipped his laptop bag. The faint click of the lock sounded small, but to him it was the steel whisper of a blade drawn before a duel. The sleek carbon fiber computer opened, its screen reflecting his face. Not with anger, but with absolute composure. Ethan's fingers moved swiftly over the keys. He connected to the inn. Flight Wi-Fi. Sluggish, but enough for what had to be done. He opened his email. The to field lay empty, waiting for the names he had prepared long before. First, Robert Klein, CEO of Aerolux Airlines. Then came the rest. The entire board of directors, the head of corporate accounts, the director of partnerships. Ethan added, Visionary Dynamics executive team, so they would see firsthand what had unfolded. And finally, 2 journalists, a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal and a Pulitzer-winning reporter from the New York Times. He paused, inhaled deeply. This was no ordinary email. It would be a death sentence for a corporate partnership worth tens of millions. Subject line: termination of $50 million. Annual corporate travel partnership. Effective immediately. Cold, concise, a blade dropping on the chessboard. No room for negotiation. He began to write. His tone was not that of a man angry, but of a lawyer addressing the court. Every word fell like a hammer. He laid out the incident, forced out of seat 2A, despite holding a confirmed ticket. He named names: Clara Myers, Gerald Whitman, Captain Martin Hale. He exposed the truth. A man of color, dressed simply, assumed unworthy of first class. He detailed the consequences: no more exclusive contracts, no more corporate accounts. Visionary Dynamics would cut all ties with Aerolux. Then came the line, sharp and final. The issue is not the inconvenience of being seated in economy. The issue is the prejudice and public humiliation inflicted on me by senior representatives of your company. A culture that tolerates such discrimination cannot be allowed to stand alongside Visionary Dynamics. He stopped. He read it through. No errors. Not a single wasted word. For a fleeting moment, Ethan's gaze softened as he thought of his employees, the people of Visionary he had promised to protect. He was not writing this for himself alone, but for them, for anyone who had ever been dismissed because of how they looked. A moment of hesitation. His finger hovered above send. In his head, the question flickered. Am I going too far? Then, as if on cue, Gerald's mocking laughter echoed back. Martin's cold stare cut into him. Clara's smug smile hovered in his memory. The doubt vanished. Ethan pressed send. The small whoosh of the email leaving was barely audible, yet to him it was the tolling of a funeral bell for Aerolux. In that instant, a $50 million contract. Months of negotiation, disintegrated into thin air, undone by the prejudice of 3 people on this flight. He closed the laptop and leaned back against the rigid seat. No more anger. Only an icy calm remained, because he knew the bomb had been released, and nothing could stop the shockwave now hurtling toward Aerolux headquarters. Chicago, 2 p.m. The harsh sunlight beat down on the glass tower housing Aerolux headquarters. On the 38th floor, Daniel Cross, Vice President of Corporate Accounts, was finishing his afternoon coffee when his computer screen flashed. An email appeared with a blazing red subject line. Termination of $50 million, annual corporate travel partnership, effective immediately. The cup slipped from his hand, crashing against the saucer with a sharp clang. The blood drained from his face. Daniel read the email straight through, every word cutting like a blade. Ethan Ward, CEO of Visionary Dynamics, had been forced out of his first-class seat, publicly humiliated, and the entire exclusive contract was now terminated effective immediately. His whole body trembled. He grabbed the direct line to the CEO, bypassing secretaries and assistants. His voice broke as he spoke. "Robert, we have a problem. A very big problem." On the 40th floor, Robert Klein, CEO of Aerolux, was in a meeting with his executive team discussing fuel strategy. His assistant handed him an iPad with the email. Within seconds, his face turned white. He shoved back his expensive leather chair, standing abruptly. "My God," he muttered. "Ward, it's Ward." He remembered the brief encounter at a tech summit, the quick handshake with Ethan, the man Aerolux had hailed as their biggest corporate client. And now, that very man had pulled the trigger, firing straight into the heart of the airline. Robert's voice thundered across the boardroom. "Get operations for Flight 714 on the line. I want to know exactly what happened. Who made that decision? Who was the captain? Who was the lead attendant?" The executives exchanged panicked glances. Minutes later, a code red alert was transmitted directly to the cockpit of the plane, now flying over the Atlantic. In the cockpit, Captain Martin Hale was sipping coffee when the small printer beside his chair rattled to life. A sheet slid out, words printed in bold uppercase. Code red. Confirm. Is passenger Ethan Ward, CEO Visionary Dynamics, onboard Flight 714. Report incident immediately. CEO and board on call. This is not a drill." Martin's face drained of color. His cup nearly slipped from his hand. He looked up at his first officer, eyes wide with shock. A chill surged down his spine. The minor inconvenience he thought he had neatly handled was a career-ending bomb. "Ward. He's the CEO. Visionary Dynamics," Martin whispered, his throat dry. He knew from the moment that paper arrived that decades of flying were over. In first class, Clara Myers was still smiling as she poured Gerald his second glass of champagne. But then the purser approached, face pale, whispering a few urgent words. Clara's eyes widened, her hand froze, and the glass in her grip trembled, champagne spilling over the rim. She turned, her gaze trailing down the aisle, past the curtain. There in seat 34B sat Ethan Ward, calm, looking out to the window. In that instant, Clara understood. Every smirk, every condescending look she had thrown at him had just transformed into a death sentence for her own career. Her heart pounded violently, her face went white, her whole body shook. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Robert Klein slammed his fist onto the table, his words cutting like steel. "We just lost $50 million. But worse, we lost our dignity. The press will tear us apart if this gets out." The atmosphere in the boardroom was as heavy as a funeral. The executives sat in silence, each one knowing a media firestorm was on its way, a storm born from the actions of those aboard Flight 714. The massive jet carved its way through white clouds, the engines humming steadily. But inside Flight 714, the atmosphere had shifted. The effortless luxury of first class had been replaced by a tension that could be felt in every breath. George Mason, the purser, rushed into the galley, after an urgent call from the cockpit. His face was ashen. "Clara," his voice rasped. "The captain wants to see you immediately. And find the passenger from seat 2A, now." Clara Myers froze mid-motion, polishing a crystal glass. Her hand trembled, wine spilling over the rim and dripping onto the floor. "The passenger from 2A?" she stammered. George locked eyes with her. "Ethan Ward, CEO of Visionary Dynamics. The strategic client this airline has staked its future on. You just forced him into economy." The blood drained from Clara's body. She gripped the counter to keep from collapsing. Cold sweat dampened her forehead. Her mind reeled as the words she had spoken and the disdainful looks she had given came rushing back like a nightmare. No, that can't be," she whispered. But denial was useless. The truth was undeniable, and the worst of it, everyone in Chicago was already watching. Minutes later, passengers in economy witnessed an unusual sight. Clara, her face pale, walked down the aisle. Gone was the authority. Gone the stiff, professional smile. Now every step shook beneath her, her eyes darting like someone searching desperately for a way out of the abyss. At row 34, she stopped. Ethan Ward sat calmly, headphones still unplugged, eyes fixed on the window. The dim glow of the sun reflected against his face, serene, yet ice-cold. "Sir, Sterling," she slipped, then quickly corrected herself. "Ward. Mr. Ward, I am so sorry. There's been a terrible mistake. Seat 2A has been prepared for you. The captain requests that I escort you back." Her voice quivered. Her eyes brimmed with panic and desperation. This was no longer an apology of courtesy. It was the plea of someone who knew her career had just been led to the execution block. Ethan turned, locking his gaze on her. His eyes were deep, calm to the point of menace. He let the silence hang, turning it into judgment. Then he spoke, soft yet thunderous in weight. "A mistake? No. You knew exactly what you were doing. Gerald knew. And your captain knew. Everyone knew. They just thought I didn't matter." Clara swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "Please come back. We'll make it right. I beg you." Ethan turned away, his eyes returning to the endless sky outside the window. His voice was low, steady, final. The chance to make it right passed 2 hours ago. The nearby passengers witnessed every moment. A few sat up straight, their jaws dropping. Power had shifted before their eyes. The man once cast down to a middle seat was now the center of gravity, while the one who had wielded authority was reduced to begging. Clara stepped back, her face contorting with despair. As she turned, her eyes were red. Her figure stumbled back up the aisle like someone walking away from their own death sentence. From economy, those paying attention saw it clearly. The order on this flight had changed. The man in the simple hoodie in seat 34B was the one with true power now, and the captain and his attendant were nothing more than pawns placed on the chopping block by their own hands. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The engines droned lower as the plane began its descent. Outside the window, the Alps gleamed in the afternoon sun, their snow, capped peaks like giant blades guarding the horizon. But inside Flight 714, The air was heavy enough for everyone to feel it. No more laughter. No more popping of champagne corks. First class had fallen into a frozen silence. Gerald Whitman sat in seat 2A, finishing his last glass of wine, but the corners of his mouth trembled, his eyes restless as he noticed Clara had vanished into the galley for the remainder of the flight. In the cockpit, Captain Martin Hale kept a firm grip on the controls, sweat beading at the back of his neck. He knew the truth. When the wheels touched down, his 30-year career would crash with them. Clara hid in the crew rest, face pale, whispering prayers that fell flat. The name Ethan Ward was echoing through Chicago, Zurich, and every boardroom that held power. The plane hit the Zurich runway, tires screeching, the fuselage shuddering. The purser, George Mason, made an announcement over the speakers, his voice stripped of its usual politeness, carrying the weight of a verdict. "Passengers, please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Captain Martin Hale and lead flight attendant Clara Myers are instructed to stay in the cockpit until ground representatives arrive." The cabin stirred with unease. Such an order had never been heard before. Some passengers turned to whisper among themselves. None knew the full story, but everyone sensed something catastrophic had unfolded. Ethan sat still in seat 34B, his face calm, as if he had foreseen it all. He did not smile, nor did he savor the moment. Inside, there was only a cold serenity. Justice was arriving. When the door opened, first, class passengers expected to disembark first. But no. The aisle was blocked by a tall man in a dark suit, his gaze heavy. Lucas Reinhardt, Vice President of Aerolux Europe, had been dispatched on emergency orders. He exchanged a few words with George, then his eyes locked on the rear of the plane. Row 34. Murmurs spread as passengers watched the executive stride past first class without stopping, heading straight into economy. Each step landed like a hammer against the hearts of Gerald, Martin, and Clara. At seat 34B, Lucas bent slightly, his voice trembling but reverent. "Mr. Ward, on behalf of Aerolux, I extend our deepest apologies. We have arranged a private car to take you directly to your hotel. All expenses have been prepared to compensate for this incident." The cabin held its breath. A man in a hoodie, forced into economy, was now being bowed to by a senior vice president of a global airline. Ethan rose. He adjusted the strap of his laptop bag, his eyes sharp as steel. "Apologies? Save them for the press. I don't need compensation. What I want is the truth laid bare." He walked forward, leaving behind the stricken faces. Gerald Whitman flushed red, Clara staring down, Martin Hale frozen like stone. And all of them knew the price they were about to pay would be far beyond anything they had ever imagined. Zurich, a cold evening. On the top floor of the Bauer au Lac Hotel, a private conference room glowed under the light of crystal chandeliers. Below, Lake Zurich lay still under the moonlight. But inside the room, the air was thick with dread. 3 men sat waiting. Robert Klein, CEO of Aerolux, pale and shaken. Lucas Reinhardt, Vice President for Europe, his back bent low, and several senior executives rushed in from headquarters. Each looked like schoolboys caught cheating on an exam, fully aware there was no excuse left to offer. The door opened. Ethan Ward entered, no longer in his simple hoodie. Tonight he wore a deep navy suit, perfectly tailored, with a dark red tie and shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it wasn't the clothing that commanded attention. It was the way he carried himself. Every step landed like a hammer, signaling the balance of power had shifted. Robert Klein jumped to his feet, forcing a nervous smile, his lips trembling. "Mr. Ward, Ethan cut him off, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "There's no need for hollow apologies. I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to set conditions." No one spoke. No one dared. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the head of the table. His eyes swept across the room. Then slowly, he raised 3 fingers. "First," he began, "Captain Martin Hale and lead flight attendant Clara Myers are to be terminated immediately. Not only that, but their records must be marked permanently in the airline industry database, with the reason clearly stated: discrimination and prejudice against a passenger. I will not allow them to wear another uniform and repeat this story elsewhere." Lucas lowered his head, scribbling furiously. Robert Klein clenched his fists, nodding slightly, knowing this was a price that could not be negotiated. "Second," Ethan continued, his voice dropping lower, "Aerolux will hire an independent firm to audit the company's culture. They will examine everything, from the boardroom to the ground staff, and that report will be made public, with no cover eeps. Customers in the world deserve to see the truth of who you are." A younger executive inhaled sharply, about to object, but Robert lifted his hand, signaling silence. There was no way back. "Third," Ethan paused, letting the weight of the silence press down on the room. "Aerolux will make a public act of atonement, not a scripted social media post, not a vague apology. I want a global press release, stating clearly what happened. That a black passenger was forced out of his first-class seat. That your company recognizes this as an act of unacceptable discrimination. You will call it by its true name." His words echoed like a bell, shattering every facade. Robert Klein bowed his head, his hand trembling as it rubbed his forehead. He knew this would become the greatest media storm in Aerolux's history. But he also knew that if they refused, the airline would collapse overnight. Ethan locked eyes with Robert, delivering his final blow. And finally, instead of collecting the $5 million from the first-year contract, Aerolux will donate the entire amount to 2 scholarship funds for black students. This is not PR. This is penance. The room fell into a deathly silence. Only the scratch of pens on paper broke it. Robert Klein lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, exhaling heavily. "We agree. To all of it." Ethan stood, slipping his laptop into his bag. He did not smile. He only nodded, his eyes cold as steel. "Good. Remember, this is not my victory. This is the test you chose for yourselves. And you failed." He left the room. Behind him, a row of executives with bowed heads, leaders who had just been exposed and sentenced by the very client they once thought beneath them. When Ethan Ward walked out of that Zurich boardroom, he didn't just leave with a personal victory. He left behind an indelible mark on Aerolux's history A reminder that prejudice, whether hidden under the guise of authority or routine service, always comes with a price. Pause for a moment and reflect. A mocking smile, a condescending glance, a decision made without verification. Those seemingly small gestures cost a corporation $50 million, left once confident employees without jobs, and forced a CEO to bow his head in apology before the entire world. This is not just a story about a first-class seat. This is a story about human dignity. Ethan did not use his power for revenge. He used it to demand change, to force a system to confront its own failures and begin to correct them. And the lesson here is for all of us. In this world, true power does not lie in where you sit. It lies in whether you dare to stand, to hold on to your dignity, and to demand change. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed because of your appearance or your background, remember this. Real strength does not need to be flaunted. It is quiet, but when it rises, it has the power to shake an entire system. So what do you think? If you were Ethan, would you choose forgiveness or action? Leave a comment with just 2 words: justice served. If this story made you reflect, hit like, subscribe, and share so others can find inspiration too. Because maybe today, you or someone close to you needs to hear this message.